Plato's 5 regimes. When you hear the term aristocracy nowadays, you probably think of a snobby hereditary upper class, but that isn't the real definition of aristocracy, or the original. In this video I'm going to explain the original definition of aristocracy to you with reference to Plato's Republic, but also with more modern examples, so we can see how it works in our modern society. The word for word, or etymological definition of aristocracy, is rule by the best. In Plato's conception of aristocracy, the nation is ruled by philosopher kings who are wise and educated in ethics, which is the study of right and wrong. Plato's conception of governmental systems in the Republic is that they are either rule by the few, rule by many, or rule by one. Aristocracy, as a form of rule by the few, is joined by timocracy and oligarchy. I'm covering them in other videos, but it's safe to say that Plato sees aristocracy as the perfect balance between the two. Why? Because in timocracy, the society and leaders are driven by honour and duty. In oligarchy, it's greed and material possessions. And in aristocracy, it's wisdom and intellect. The aristocrats are able to keep their own desires in check and prioritise the good of the people, and only the best people can become aristocrats in the first place. In this sense, Plato's conception of aristocracy is closer to meritocracy, where power is vested according to merit. A good example of Plato's conception of aristocracy in our society is the US Supreme Court, where the judges, who have been educated in ethics, are appointed according to merit. Plato's definition of aristocracy raises the question of why we now associate aristocracy with rule by a hereditary class. Some have criticised Plato's definition of aristocracy because he doesn't specify the number of philosopher kings, meaning his definition can be seen as analogous to monarchy or rule by one philosopher king. This increases the chances of nepotism, which is where a ruler gives power to their family members to keep himself in power, and that is probably where the hereditary form of aristocracy comes from, a distorted version of Plato's own definition. To conclude, aristocracy is a form of government in which the few rule, but they are the best. In this sense, it's closer to meritocracy than the modern version of aristocracy that hands power to a small hereditary class. You'll see how aristocracy degenerates into timocracy. We're looking at timocracy, or rule by honour and duty. In this video I'm going to give you a detailed definition of timocracy with reference to Plato's Republic as well as modern day examples. In the Republic, Plato represents timocracy as a degeneration from aristocracy. The philosopher kings in aristocracies that have a perfect balance of intellect and wisdom are replaced by people that prioritise honour and duty. These more militarily inclined, less philosophical rulers prioritise their own power over the good of the nation. Plato represents timocracy as the middle ground between aristocracy and oligarchy, where greed rules. In this sense, it's important to underline that Plato had great respect for timocracy. He lauded states like Sparta for constructing their society like an army and not ceding to a materialistic oligarchy, or the kind of anarchistic system that Plato represents democracy as. Modern day examples of timocratic systems include the UK House of Lords, where the majority of members are appointed due to their loyalty to whatever party is in government. As well as this, some have argued that Trump is a timocrat, as he espouses this prioritisation of honour and duty over substance. His election slogan further reflects this: "Make America Great Again," so devoid of substance, yet still imbued with that intangible and subjective word great. What's greatness? The Constitution? America? To conclude, timocracy is the middle ground between aristocracy and oligarchy, the next step on Plato's degeneration into tyranny. Timocrats prioritise duty and honour over more philosophical virtues. Their leaders are more power-hungry and less inclusive of all. Yet they're not as bad as oligarchs. We're looking at oligarchy. Similarly to aristocracy, Plato's definition of the word contrasts with our modern-day understanding of it, meaning it needs a more detailed definition. Word for word, oligarchy means rule by the few. In this sense, both aristocracy and timocracy are forms of oligarchy, whereas democracy is ruled by many, and tyranny is ruled by one. However, Plato's oligarchy is different. It's separate from both aristocracy and timocracy. Instead, it's a kind of plutocracy, where the rich rule. In Plato's conception of governmental systems degenerating from aristocracy all the way to tyranny, oligarchy comes after timocracy. The ruling few's priorities have shifted from honour and duty, and the desire for power that was left unchecked in timocracy has led to greed. Laws are restricted so that only the rich oligarchs have power. In Plato's view, this materialistic society has many problems that will lead to it becoming a democracy. Huge inequality angers the poor and makes them ripe for revolution. Because of the leaders' priorities shifting from honour and duty to money, the military is also weakened. Also, society is more generally weakened by the fact that positions are decided by income as opposed to merits. It's the inverse of a meritocracy. A good example of this kind of a system is pre-revolutionary France, a vastly unequal society that soon fell into revolution when the poor had had enough. So to conclude, oligarchy is the last of Plato's rule by the few. A materialistic society dominated by greed. It soon falls into a democracy, followed by tyranny. Democracy is the most common form of government in the Western world. In this video, we will look at Plato's definition of democracy in the Republic and why he detested it, and contrast that with our modern understanding of it. The word-for-word definition of democracy is ruled by the people. Plato represents democracy as very similar to anarchy, and the only regime of rule by many. In Plato's conception of government systems degenerating from aristocracy all the way down to tyranny, democracy is the fourth system in this cycle. After oligarchy has led to a society rife with inequality, the lower classes revolt and institute rule by many, in which freedom and equality are the law. People are driven by self-interest. They do whatever they want. It's easy to see why Plato disliked this type of system, because an ideology of mob rule led to the death of his mentor Socrates. As well as this, Plato believed that complete equality naturally bred paranoia, leading to people instituting tyrants, which we'll find out about in the next episode. However, it's important to caveat that democracies are not all bad, contrary to Plato's opinions. Modern liberal democracies succeed in maintaining hierarchy and avoiding mob rule by combining free and fair elections with constitutions that protect the minority, as well as securing certain rights that majoritarian decisions can't do away with, for example, freedom of speech. To conclude, Plato's highly pessimistic definition of democracy raises some legitimate concerns about rule by the majority. His main one being that it risks leading to tyranny, our subject for next week. Modern democracies have found a way to prevent this from happening by utilising checks and balances, however. In our final episode on Plato's 5 systems of government in the Republic, we're going to take a look at tyranny, the worst form of government according to Plato. Plato's conception of government systems is that they degenerate, starting with the ideal, aristocracy, finishing with tyranny. Controversially, Plato sees tyranny as developing out of a system that we might conceive as the ideal, democracy. Now, the reason why Plato dislikes democracy so much is because he saw it as a kind of mob rule that vested power in the hands of an uneducated class, which then led to complete freedom and equality, getting rid of all hierarchy. Plato describes in the Republic how excessive increase of anything often causes a reaction in the opposite direction. Basically, by this he meant that with no hierarchy, paranoia and fear of others develops, leading to people instituting a tyrant. The tyrant is a form of rule by one, or autocracy, and with democracy having legitimized all wants and desires, the tyrant is able to do as he pleases, leading to murder and terror. To conclude, we can see that Plato's favourite government system is aristocracy, as the leaders are fair and virtuous, and it maintains social hierarchy. In timocracy and oligarchy, Plato sees the leaders' priorities shifting, only slightly at first towards honour and duty, as opposed to the good of all, before fully shifting towards a society based around greed and materialism. This then leads to social inequalities and society flipping towards rule by the lower classes, who put in place complete freedom and equality. With everyone now on the same level, paranoia arises, leading to people putting in place a tyrant. With tyranny, murder and terror rules, desires that have been slowly more legitimized ever since the fall from aristocracy. So aristocracy provides a balance between dictatorial rule by the few versus rule by the mob, whilst also keeping certain wants and desires in check. That's Plato's 5 regimes.